The challenge in this task for today was deciding what to include and how to organize my story so it made some sense and fit the time available, especially fit the time available. The solution came to me when I was out on a long bike ride, when I was not consciously thinking about the problem, and I realized that this month's Soul Matters packet, Nurture Generations, one of the options in there had the solution for me. Option C had questions for interviewing another person. Questions like, what was your spiritual upbringing? What historical events shaped you? What influences your spiritual religious life? So I started with those questions and I interviewed myself. So I'm going to start first with one of two important historical events in my life.
Libby was there. Can you hear me now? What did I do when she was here?
Anita, I need to let...
Send chat to Libby Moore?
Anita.
No. Everyone, send chat to everyone.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yep. So I'm going to start with a story that's an important historical event in my life. This is a story of leaving and loss. About 10 years ago, poking around on the internet, I found a remarkable gift someone had placed online at a West Virginia historical site, a list of all the descendants of Abraham Perry. Abraham Perry was my fourth great-grandfather. And this document had the list of every child, every spouse, the whole tree of about 500 people who were either born a Perry or were a Perry by marriage. This list started with Abraham, who was born 1735 in Bertie County, North Carolina. That county's on the coast of North Carolina near Kitty Hawk. He was married to a Mary Robinson in 1755, also from that born in that same county, and had one child, a son named Arnold, born in 1784 in Perrytown, North Carolina. I had to look that up to see if it still exists, and it does, sort of. There is a rural crossroads with a volunteer fire department of that name and an Assembly of God church, and not much else. And the nearest town of any consequence is White's Beach. Now, I don't know the backstory on that one, but I'm sure there is one. It'd be in the South. Anyway, starting with Abraham Perry's son, Arnold, apparently an only child. He left the coast of North Carolina in the early 1800s and found his way over the Appalachian Mountains to the valley of the Tug River, which was then on the frontier. The first recorded permanent settlement was believed to have been around 1800. And he shows up in that area around 1810 when he marries a Polly Ratcliffe in Pike County, Kentucky. Actually, Pike County didn't even exist then. It was part of another county and was later split off. They had a fruitful marriage, and for the next 3 generations of Perrys, they mostly stuck to the adjoining counties of Pike and Floyd in Kentucky, and more often were across the river in the counties of Wayne and Logan. This is in the Tug River Valley, which is at the border. The Tug River is the border between Kentucky and West Virginia, what's now West Virginia. So these Perrys are in this 4-county area for 3 generations. Along the way, there's the Civil War, which splits Virginia in 2 and creates West Virginia. which stayed with the Union, as we probably remember. There were a couple of marriages of Perrys and Hatfields. This is the Hatfields of Hatfields and McCoys, the famous feud. The railroad came in around 1880, and with it came the coal companies. Then this region was the site of bloody battles over unionizing the mines, most famously in 1912 through 13, and in 1920 through 21. There's a PBS documentary called The Mine Wars, which covers that history. And there's a John Sayles film, Matewan, that perhaps some people might have seen. My grandfather, Thomas Jefferson Perry, was a teacher and the supervisor of a school in one of the mining towns, one of the mining camps. These mining camps not only had a company store, but they also would have a company school for the children of the miners who were basically captive in company housing in these mine camps. My father, Walter Perry, was born in 1918 in the town of Kermit, West Virginia. If you've closely watched the news of the opioid crisis in West Virginia and Appalachia, you have probably seen images of pharmacies in Kermit, West Virginia that are notorious pill mills today. Anyway, my father's born in Kermit, and the family is living in a mining camp. By the 1930 census, my grandfather moved his growing family out of coal country to the small college town of Athens, West Virginia, where he would teach in high school for the rest of his working life. And that's also the same town where I went to elementary school when I come into the story. My mother's family, I don't know as much about. What I know goes back several generations in the Green Sulphur Springs area, which is another, basically just a crossroad, near Hinton, West Virginia, not far from something you may have heard of or seen, which is the New River Gorge. If you've ever driven on the interstate down through West Virginia, you may have passed over the New River Gorge. Okay, that was probably 30 miles or so from where my mother's family lived. The Halls lived several miles up a dirt road in a hollow. The family farmed, and my grandfather was mostly away working construction jobs in the summer. Farming was pretty hard business in the West Virginia hills. You needed a job that paid cash so you could buy stuff from the store that you couldn't grow. Anyway, my mother and father met at Concord College in Athens, West Virginia, that same town where my dad grew up, where my grandfather was a school teacher. Dad graduated and went into the Army. He continued courting my mother, and they married in 1942. And then I was born just before VE Day in April of 1945, when while my father was still stationed in Lebanon, near Lebanon, Pennsylvania. So I was actually born in Pennsylvania. My father got out of the Army and pooled his savings from his military pay with money that his father had, and they bought 200 acres of some farmland and mostly trees and rocks in the country between Athens and Princeton. Princeton, you may have been through if you've ever been on the West Virginia Turnpike. It's one of the last exits in West Virginia before you get to Bluefield. So this 200 acres they bought has some history about it, in that it was the site, and you'll find it indicated on the map as being Mercer Healing Springs. There was, in the early 1900s, a resort on that property, where people came to take the waters at the healing spring. And there was a 4-story, 65-room hotel, which not too long after it opened, burned to the ground, burned to the foundation in 1922, and never operated again. But that is the property that my grandfather and my father bought, and that we lived in, or lived on, I should say, after World War II. I was a free-range child before we knew that term. I was given to wandering the pastures and the woods on our property, accompanied only by a family dog. I would be gone for hours, far, far out of sight of the house. When I would finally wander back to the house, I would sometimes be asked, "Were you lost?" And I would say, "No, I always knew where I was." So often these wanderings took me down to my grandparents' house, which was only a half-mile or less down the road. And there was also a nice path through the woods to get there. My Aunt Mona and my Uncle Bob were still teenagers in this time period when I was, I'll say, between 4 and 10 years old when we were there. So they were down there at the house, and my grandparents were there. My Aunt Mona, short, what I called Ramona, was my babysitter when my mother went back to finish her degree at Concord College. And summers were often spent, part of the summer was spent with my Hall grandparents and my Uncle Dean, my mother's youngest brother, who was still a teenager when I would spend the summer with them, and I would torment Dean to get his attention. So I was an only child, but I was surrounded by this large extended family, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and more cousins than I could keep track of. For me, life in West Virginia was pretty idyllic. I was too young then to do the hardest work of farming, and I was pretty clueless as to how uncertain our economic future was in West Virginia. Things that happened around, during, and after World War II, the coal mines got mechanized and loads of union jobs went away. Strip mining and mountaintop removal came in, and good paying jobs were really getting scarce. So the Perrys, who had stayed put for 4 generations, my parents' generation became part of what's termed the West Virginia diaspora, scattering in all directions to states with better prospects. For my parents in 1955, when I was 10, that was better paying teaching jobs in St. Petersburg, Florida, and a tract home. No more farm, no more woods. It was never home to me. Florida was too flat, too hot, too ugly. I missed those green rolling hills of West Virginia, and I missed the family that would never be as close again. And I pretty soon learned that being identified with West Virginia was not an asset. It got me labeled as a hillbilly and associated with all the movie and cartoon stereotypes of being foolish, uneducated, quick to violence, backwards, and likely to marry a cousin. So I started keeping my West Virginia origins to myself, and I could always confuse people by telling them I was born in Pennsylvania. For the record, other places I've lived are Atlanta, where I went to Georgia Tech, Albuquerque, where I was a Vista volunteer, Atlanta again, where Atlanta just got to be too big for me, Auburn, Alabama, which turned out to be way too small for Ann, Los Angeles, which was brown most of the year because of no rain and was too damn big all the time for both of us. And then finally, Rochester, which is home, and we're not moving again. So, and in the last decade or so, I've started looking into my family history and started to own my Appalachian roots. A little late, but it's never too late to be who you are. All right. Now I'm going to switch to a different topic, and that is, what was my spiritual or religious upbringing? Back in West Virginia, where we were out on the farm, there was really not much that I can remember. We didn't go to church. Sundays were just another work day for a school teacher who had a farm to tend. I do remember a couple of ethical teachings from my childhood. The one time I can remember getting switched by my father on the legs was when I lied to my parents about playing in the chicken coop. That upset the chickens, and I also got chicken shit all over my clothes, so I don't know how I ever thought I was going to get away with saying I didn't do it. And the other thing that I picked up along somewhere in there was my parents never tolerated me using derogatory terms for other ethnic or racial groups. And if you grew up in the 50s before we got more politically correct, you know there's just a whole dictionary worth of derogatory terms for practically every group on the planet. So, but those were off limits to me, and that was a good thing. A related memory to share from that West Virginia period. I remember an interaction with kids at my elementary school in 1954 about the Supreme Court ruling on Brown v. Board of Education. The loud talkers among my friends were adamant about they were never going to school with fill in the blank. I didn't agree. It didn't seem fair to me, and I may have said so. But what I really learned then, I'm sad to acknowledge, was that speaking out probably would have cost me my friends. And that is one of the ways that white supremacy culture has been enforced for centuries. Back to my religious upbringing, after moving to Florida, my practical parents picked the closest Protestant church to our new home. That turned out to be a newly planted Presbyterian church of the Southern Presbyterian denomination. You know, if you follow church history, you know a lot of Protestant denominations split over the issue of slavery and the war. As we learned it in school, the war between the states. But at Pasadena Presbyterian Church, there was Sunday school and children's choir, which took anybody, including people who can't sing a note. And eventually there was catechism class. And that starts with the first one being, what is man's chief end? And that might be familiar to many of you. And you can ask me afterwards what the answer is if you want. And eventually baptism as a teenager. This was sprinkled, not dunked. Another related memory, in 1960, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which you probably know as SNCC, organized sit-ins across the South. And in addition to lunch counters and swimming pools with wade-ins, there were at least threats and maybe a few occasions where SNCC would have pray-ins at whites-only churches. I actually went looking on Google and I couldn't find news of any incident where it happened, but plenty of mention of where it was discussed at a strategy meeting when SNCC was founded, where Martin Luther King met with them, and they talked about having pray-ins. Well, our church was apparently in a little uproar about this as a possibility, and the minister at my church during the service told the congregation that if Negroes came to our church, we should ignore them. In time, they would leave and go back where they would feel comfortable with their own kind. Now, at the time, this bothered me, and it still bothered me, and this was just not in keeping with what I had been led to understand was a Christian view about how to treat the stranger and how to treat your brother. So that stuck with me. By high school, anything church for me was mostly about seeing my friends in the youth group that met Sunday evenings. And I did my best to sleep in on Sunday mornings to see if I could avoid going to church. Sometimes I was successful and sometimes not. Now, returning to the second of two historical events that are important in my life, or very important in my life, I have to talk about the whole decade of the 60s. The 60s profoundly altered the course of my life. At the start of that decade, if you'd asked me what I was going to do, I expected to get an engineering degree. I expected to get a good paying job in the space program. And that good paying job in the space program was going to make it possible for me to afford to race sports cars, which was actually my passion at the time. And I started out true to that plan. I entered Georgia Tech in 1963, majoring in aerospace engineering. I got straight A's in my first quarter there. By the way, that was never to be repeated. I started out good and went downhill from there. I got hired as a co-op with the Martin Company in Orlando. This was like alternating work quarters, school quarters for first 3 years of the engineering program, 8 quarters in all. At Martin, I connected with enthusiasts in the company sports car club. And for a while, the future seemed pretty clear, but that was not to last. And now, in sort of roughly chronological order, here are some things that changed my path. Growing up in Florida, the topic of, particularly in the early 60s, the topic of Cuba was a hot issue. And it bothered me to learn eventually that JFK okayed CIA plots to try to assassinate Castro. Our support of the invasion at the Bay of Pigs troubled me, that we were meddling in the choice of the Cuban people about who their government was going to be. And then there was that Cuban Missile Crisis, where I was aware we had missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. And when the Soviets put missiles into Cuba, that seemed like tit for tat to me. And I was, along with pretty much everybody else in the country, was really worried as we were taken to what looked like the brink of a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, before there were secret agreements that 6 months later, that settled things down. And then 6 months later, we quietly removed our missiles from Turkey, and the Soviets moved theirs out of Cuba. But that was entirely too close to total catastrophe. Then the civil rights movement. Now, I was living in a white bubble, but I did watch the news on TV, and I did read newspapers. And I saw what was going on, and I read about what was going on, and I knew it to be a just cause, but didn't particularly find how to get involved. And I really wasn't ready to get out of my own comfort zone, for that matter. But I knew it was the right thing. And there's that Vietnam War. Uh, it under Johnson, it turned into a major war, and it was already headed that way under JFK. And under Johnson, it really turned into a major war. And the more I learned about it, the stronger I felt that we should have never gotten involved. And there was the draft that might be there when I got out of school. And there was what I found to be the soulless nature of a lot of the work that we did as co-op students at the Martin Company. The worst of this wasn't my job, but a good friend of mine, also from Georgia Tech. His job as a co-op was to run computer programs to calculate the probability of maiming or severely wounding but not killing enemy soldiers with bomblets. These are the bombs that include lots of little bombs that then scatter over a large area and then explode when they get near the ground and blast with shrapnel anybody who is not under cover. They were used widely in the Vietnam War by our side. And the reason to wound and not kill is the calculation that a wounded soldier takes another soldier out of the fight to care for them. So, and often leaves them with missing limbs or extremely serious injuries. So, all right, we continue on to about almost 1968. After I finished my final co-op session, and I stuck with it because that was the way I was paying for Georgia Tech, I officially changed my major to applied psychology. At least I figured with that I would not be working in the military industrial complex, or not likely to, although I really didn't know what I was going to do with it. Another thing that was important to me in this period was the war on poverty and all the publicity talk, discussion about it. It exposed for me the human cost of poverty in the country and kind of opened my eyes to what I had seen around me in West Virginia as a child, where there were kids in my elementary school who had clearly never seen a dentist in their life. And, just for one example. And it also, is an impact on me that war on Vietnam took up all the resources that would have made the war on poverty actually effective in doing something. That is it's actually the closest we've come in the country to actually making a dent in poverty was what happened under Johnson in the war on poverty. There were things that were done that actually had real effect, real impact. All right. The Tet Offensive in January 1968. Again, this is something I read about and saw photos and images and video that impacted me. For me, it made it clear that our defeat in Vietnam was going to be inevitable. It was only a question of how many on both sides would die before it ended. And I do remember I remember sitting alone in my apartment, looking at photos in Time magazine of dead soldiers and dead civilians, and just weeping. In April 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King. I joined the thousands who were standing in the street around Ebenezer Baptist Church during King's funeral service. And that prompted more action on my part, finally. I got a summer job that was poverty program funded with Atlanta Parks Recreation for a summer camp that was a summer work camp for kids off the street in Atlanta. I was one of 4 camp counselors. 2 were white, 2 were black. Our campers were all black teenagers. We slept in tents. We were up on Lake Allatoona, north of Atlanta, where the city owned land, and we were clearing trees and brush and making a swimming hole, or a beach, making a beach. The pretend sort of thing was that we were going to fix up this land for what would be a campground or a picnic area, but probably it was basically make work. It was someplace we could put the kids and give them an experience outdoors. The work was never particularly the important part of it. The transformative thing about that summer was the relationship that I formed with one of the black counselors. Ricky was one of the first black students to integrate Georgia Tech. We shared a tent for the summer, and we shared our lives. And at the end of the summer, we took a road trip to California and back together, driving through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Two young kids in a VW Bug. We were damned careful where we went and where we stopped, and until we got out into the West. This was not that long after the Mississippi 3, Goodman, Swain, Churn, and anyway. At the end, and for both of us, this was the first close friendship across racial lines. Really, actually, the first close friendship across that line. And it changed both of our lives. And a few years ago, thanks to Facebook, I reconnected with Ricky, and we've seen each other a few times, been to each other's houses. He's in Atlanta, and of course, we're up here. Also 1968, during that same summer and then the fall, the 1968 presidential campaign. Clean for Gene McCarthy. You remember that? The Robert Kennedy assassination, the chaos at the Democratic Convention, the police riots in the streets, and basically the end of the New Deal Democratic coalition, the Nixon secret plan to end the war by making it last another 6 years. Nixon winning, even though George Wallace took 5 southern states. That ascendancy of the Southern strategy, and Johnson's prediction of losing the South for decades after signing the civil rights bills back in when Johnson was seen as a good guy by the left. Back at Georgia Tech for my final 2 quarters, I and a few friends organized the Tech Action Committee. This was our name for a student organization registered on campus so we could use campus facilities, devoted to social justice. I served as its first chairman until I graduated that year in 69. We had planning meetings. Who doesn't have planning meetings? We argued about whether to support Humphrey in the election. We did educational work on campus, showed films, leafleted, did some guerrilla theater. We supported anti-war and anti-racism marches in Atlanta. And there was a road trip to the counter-inaugural in Washington, D.C. This was the hippie, yippie, and SDS counter-programming rally to the presidential inauguration. Mostly personally about that, or what was mostly memorable personally was standing in the rain and mud, listening to Phil Oakes sing. So, also, the Tech Action Committee made a connection with a Vista volunteer who had some projects for student volunteers. We've provided volunteers to tutor people to get GED and to help organize a food buying co-op in Atlanta in the housing projects. In the winter of 69, I was summoned to the Dean of Students office and informed I might want to be careful that the FBI had taken an interest in the Tech Action Committee. That sort of put us on the map, I guess. Having no future job lined up and encouraged by Vista volunteers, by that Vista volunteer, I applied to join Vista and was actually surprised to be accepted. I spent a year in Albuquerque as a Vista volunteer. We were really unsupervised and just set loose to do stuff as long as we didn't embarrass anybody. So we didn't accomplish very much in that year. Then to end up, we're here, May 1970. The famous thing is the killing of 4 students at Kent State by the National Guard. But there were similar incidents around the country on other campuses. And one of those was the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. After Kent State killings, students there occupied the student center, and where they were there for a few days, and they were trying to negotiate with the campus president, and the local politicians were raising stink and demanding that the kids be arrested and thrown out of the student center. So an agreement was reached that those who wanted to be arrested would stay in the building and the city police would come in and arrest them. And that part worked out just as fine as planned. But what didn't work out so well was the National Guard, a unit from down in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, out in the rural ranch area, was brought in to secure the outside of the building. And these folks deployed, well, I should say, people left the building who weren't going to be arrested and were gathered outside the building. And these guard folks deployed to go around the building wearing gas masks and carrying rifles with unsheathed bayonets. And in the chaos that followed as they moved into position and tried to move people back, a television cameraman was bayoneted in the leg and almost died. And one personal friend of mine who had a broken leg and was in a cast and on crutches got pushed to the ground and roughed up a bit. The guard commander afterwards tried the initial story that some people must have fallen into the rose bushes. the fact a network TV guy got bayoneted put an end to that lie pretty quickly.
So
All right.
Tom,
Yep.
Tom,
I-
Tom,
Mhm.
can you wrap up so we can have time for some questions?
I've got one more thing.
Okay, great.
Okay. So this takes us to the end of my year in Vista. And I will tell you that I was in a really dark place at that time. The student left was fractured. The white backlash to the gains of the civil rights movement were going on and still going on. Nixon was in office, and the war was going on, and I didn't know what I was going to do when I got back to Atlanta. And then I saw an article in the Great Speckled Bird, which I had subscribed to, about an activist trip to Cuba. And I figured that I had no good reason to say not to say yes to that opportunity. So I applied and came back to Atlanta and went on the Vince Ramos Brigade, met Ann, and you've heard some of the rest of the story in her talk a few weeks ago. But to recap, where the 60s took me from expecting to get an engineering degree and that good paying job and race sports cars to having an applied psychology degree I had no plans to use, no job prospects, and the luxury of being able to choose the intentional poverty of being an activist. So we'll stop there.
I know how much more